Well, the reason it matters is the nature of the Israel lobby. It has two features to it. There's the hardcore, which is a lobby. They're paid agents of a foreign country, and their job is to try to sell the foreign country's policies to the United States, sort of like the Cuba lobby. There's an Israel lobby. But beyond the hardcore, what makes the lobby so powerful is the periphery of large numbers of Jews in influential places, in magazines, in newspapers, on television, in film, a large periphery of Jews who also have deeply felt, heartfelt feelings for Israel. And that periphery is now being lost. American Jews just don't...
And so what? And what your argument is that you're left with this hardcore that you say are being paid, what, by the Israeli government to get their way with Washington?
They're a lobby. That's their job.
But are you saying they're paid by the Israeli government to get their way in Washington?
I would say that's what a lobby does. A Cuba lobby lobbies for Cuba. An Ireland lobby lobbies for Ireland. And this lobby lobbies, and this lobby...
But they're not... AIPAC would say they are not paid by the Israeli government.
That's the nature of how American society works. You have
lobbies. Are you saying that they're paid by Israel? I just wanted to...
Actually, I'll tell you the truth. I don't even know how they're paid. And it's not particularly important. As an American, that's the way our system works. No, that's the way our system... That's the way our system works. Our system works through lobbies. And there are lobbies.
It is very important because you make certain claims and you enrage people, and they wonder then whether they should listen to the next thing that you say.
If you read their statements, they freely say, we work for Israel. Israel is our cause. And as an American, you're allowed to do that. That's the nature of our system.
So 10 years ago, there were people who said, actually what you're saying isn't new, and there are plenty of people who make exactly that case. Peter Novik's book about the Holocaust. But there's something about the way they, and for example, Peter Novik, made the case that was more powerful, because they had an understanding, a sensitivity that was absent in your book, and that as a result, your book came across as a rant. And that's the suggestion about a lot of the arguments that you make. And that as a result, we have the likes of Jonathan Friedland accusing you of doing the anti-Semites' work for them. And because you see Jews as either villains or victims, he says, I fear that takes him closer to the people who created the Holocaust than to those who suffered in it.
Well, Mr. Friedland is, of course, entitled to his judgment, but then we can also quote the judgment of the world's leading authority in the Nazi Holocaust by a wide margin, and that's Raoul Hilberg, the author of the classic The Destruction of the European Jews, the 3-volume work. Now, Raoul Hilberg, he praised my book. He actually called it, since you said I go too far, I'm quoting him now, he said my findings were conservative. He said he went through the same record as I did, and in fact, I understate the case in my book. So between Jonathan Friedland, who's a modestly talented columnist, and Raoul Hilberg, who's the world's leading authority in the Nazi Holocaust, I think the judgment of Hilberg is higher.
I could quote so many other people to you who have been very critical and are known as experts in the Holocaust.
No, I wouldn't say nobody is in the same rank as Mr. Hilberg.
But the point is that it's your style, and that your style ends up being self-defeating. And the argument, for example, that you feed the anti-Semites, do you ever have any qualms that actually you are doing, that you could be doing their work for them?
Yeah, there is a problem there, and one has to be honest about those things. There is a problem that you can end up being useful to people who you don't particularly like. Everybody has those sorts of problems when they're trying to deal with controversial subjects, that you don't want to give fodder to your enemy. And then you have to make, decisions. You have to think through what you're saying, and you have to carry on responsibly.
Do you ever hold back?
Excuse me?
Do you ever hold back? Do you ever self-censor?
Yeah, the Holocaust industry is now an old book for me. As I said, it's 10 years ago. But when I wrote the book, I can say to you metaphorically, my parents had already passed away, but metaphorically, my parents were right behind me. They were looking at me over my shoulders, and they were looking at every word.
Okay, but I ask you, so you make the point that's 10 years ago, and I appreciate that, but it's only recently you said of Israel, it's a crazy country, it's like a junkie. Every few years they go to war, they need their fix, they're lunatics. American Jews don't want to defend that.
Yeah, Israel is carrying on in a lunatic fashion. I would like to ask you...
And Hezbollah, who you went to meet?
I would like to ask you, Name me another country in the world. 2003, Israel was the cheerleaders for the war in Iraq. 2006, it went into war in Lebanon. 2008, 2009, it attacked Gaza. Now it talks about attacking Iran. If you read the Israeli papers every day, they talk about, should we attack Gaza? Should we attack Lebanon? Should we attack Syria? Name me another country in the world that falls into that category.
Well,
that's a lunatic state.
Israel would point to a number of its neighbors and say exactly the same thing.
No, you show me how many countries. How many countries has Iran planned to attack? No, let's ask a simple question. How many countries in the last 10 years has Iran attacked?
When you look...
No, that's a fair question. How many countries in the last 10 years has Iran attacked?
When you look at the history of Israel, do you not have some sympathy or understanding, people would ask, as to why they feel threatened and why
we're not talking about why they feel threatened. We're talking about a country that every 2 or 3 years goes to war. And if you follow the press as I do, every day they talk about let's attack this country, let's attack that country. That's not normal. And when I call it a lunatic state... So
why is it that the Israeli people vote in this government that you say is responsible for that?
I think it's a regrettable fact. I don't say these things with glee. I'm not happy about that fact. As the American economist, the Nobel laureate Paul Krugman, put it in the New York Times last week, he said it's perfectly obvious Israel's headed towards national suicide. It's become a crazy state. And he says it's not good for Jews, it's not good for the world where Israel is headed.
And yet it's still seen, of course, as the safe haven, the homeland for the Jews. Well, you have a right to live there, although you're banned. Right. Would you go back?
I think that's a contradiction in terms, but we'll leave that aside.
I know, but you could test it. Would you go there?
Would I go to Israel? I think there's a misunderstanding here. I don't have any particularly hostile feelings towards Israel, nor feelings of love towards the state of Israel. It's just not my thing. My thing is, I want to achieve a just and lasting peace for the Palestinians and for the Israelis.
It's very hard to reconcile that statement about your lack of feelings towards the country with the fact that it's the center of your work for decades.
It's sort of like you have strong feelings about the media. That's your work. And for the past 30 years, that's where I've devoted my energies.
And the question of identity.
I have opinion.
I ask you about whether you would go back, go there.
Well, I can't go back. America is my home.
And every year you used to go to Israel.
No, every year I used to go.
Do you feel any connection to it as a Jew,
I don't want to put on false pretenses. I'm not going to start, beating my breast. No, I'm an American. I was born in the United States. My parents were from Eastern Europe. There's no connection with Israel. I have some American friends who emigrated to Israel, and I remain in touch with them. We remain friends. But beyond that, I have no more special connection with Israel than I have with any other part of the world. And I'm not going to pretend otherwise.
Thank you for coming on Hard Talk.
Sure, my pleasure. Number 2, Mr. Charney, I lost my job. I lost my living. I lost my profession because I was denouncing the hooligans, the hoodlums, and the racketeers who have been exploiting the suffering of my parents. So please don't lecture me about how people make money off of the Nazi Holocaust. I am currently unemployed because I denounced the hoodlums, the hooligans, and the racketeers who exploited my parents' suffering. problem is not Hamas. Hamas has repeatedly said it's willing to settle the conflict in the June 1967 border.
But still they refuse to recognize the state of Israel.
Well, they refuse to recognize what they call the legitimacy of the state of Israel. But under international law, they're not obliged to recognize the legitimacy of the state of Israel. And that's the same position of Hamas. They said, well, settle the conflict in the June 1967 border.
But Finkelstein, this is what makes Jerusalem unwary of Hamas, because they keep saying, how can we have a neighbor which doesn't recognize our legitimacy?
Yeah, but you see, the problem is, listen to your own language. You're just spouting Israeli propaganda. Why are you saying Jerusalem?
ما قبل از این گفتگو با سخنگوی حماس داشتیم صحبت میکردیم. سخنگوی حماس تأکید داشت که ما اسرائیل رو به رسمیت نمیشناسیم. خیلی از اسرائیلی ها، مقام های اسرائیلی میگن که چطور میشه با سازمانی کنار اومد یا در کنار گروهی زندگی کرد که هم مسلحه، هم مناطقی رو در اختیار داره و هم حق زندگی رو برای ما قائل نیست.
من فکر میکنم که شما مشکل دارین در شنیدن به حرفای من فکر میکنم اینگی به خاطر اینکه همه این تلاش‌ها برای این بود که اسرائیل حتما بتونه یک واکنشی رو از حماس بیرون بکشه تا ناچار نشه که وارد مذاکره بشه. حالا سوال من از شما اینه، اگر یک دولت اتحاد ملی شکل می‌گرفت، اگر که اتحادیه اروپا و آمریکا میپذیرفتن که با یک دولت اتحاد ملی مذاکره بکنن، چه چیزی میتونه جلوی توافق رو بگیره؟ شما میگید که حماسه، اما این باعث میشه که این عملا حرف باعث میشه که شما تبدیل بشید به کسی که داره دفاع میکنه از اسرائیل. به خاطر اینکه
آقای فینکلستین، من نظر
هذا التوصيف صحيح، ولكن قبل سنة 2000 بعد 2000 صار في انسحاب إسرائيلي من منطقة الجنوب، صار في انقسام بداخل لبنان بين الأطراف السياسية اللبنانية حول موضوع مستقبل السلاح وموضوع المقاومة. يعني هذا الانقسام الذي حصل أنت هون عم تفوت طرف فيه، أنت عم تكون طرف بالنهاية. أنت عم تقول أنت عم تجي على لبنان زيارة، ولكن ما عم تشوف تداعيات اللي عم بيصير. بالنهاية تداعيات حرب تموز على الناس.
Listen, if you want to close your eyes and believe it was all over in May 2000, you can do so. You can play that game. But the reality was, and everyone understood it, that the Israeli attitude was, we're going to knock out Hezbollah. And they began planning for a new war right after they were forced to leave in 2000. They found their excuse, their pretext, in July 2006. But there's no question among rational people that Israel was never going to let that victory go by, the Hezbollah victory go by.
They were determined
to teach
كان يمكن تجنبه. يعني هون ممكن يقدر الطرف الآخر يقول لك ممكن تجنبه ما توقع بالفخ.
It could not have been avoided. There is no way that the United States and Israel are going to tolerate any resistance in the Arab world. You want to pretend it can be avoided, you can play that game. But serious people, clear-headed people, knew there was going to be a war sooner or later.
They're not legal. The Israeli government acknowledged they weren't legal, privately. Meron was then asked a couple of years ago, do you still stand by the statement you made in 1967? He said, yes, it's true. The settlements are illegal. Allow me to finish.
I will, but just remember, it's a TV show, not a lecture. That's all I'm saying. Very important you put the facts across, but do try and put them across in a pithy manner.
If you want to just chat, then you should cut me off. I'm interested in facts. I'm not interested in chatting, and I'm not interested in propaganda. And very close, very intricate, very complicated. Allow me to finish. He says that Israel's held to a double standard. Let's look at the double standard. during Operation Cast Lead in 2008-9, Israel killed 1,400 Palestinians, destroyed 6,300 homes, killed 350 Palestinian children. What happened as a result of that? Israel prosecuted one soldier. One soldier got 7.5 months in jail for stealing a credit card. Stealing a credit card. That was the result of killing 1,400 Palestinians, 1,200 of whom were civilians, 350 of whom were children, 6,300.
I'm sorry. This is this is a classic example of.
Well, can I just interject on this point?
It's not the topic. We're not debating it. The professor's saying everything totally out of context. He's ignoring Hezbollah's terrorist tunnels. He's ignoring the thousands of missiles targeting Israeli civilians. He's just sorry.
Okay, guys, you need to one at a time. Look, let me just interject here for a second. Now, Norman, you're raising points. You raised, for example, Operation Cast Lead. Now, it should be obvious to anyone that the methods the Israeli army employed in that conflict, which have been spoken about numerous times by officers from other armies, exceeds that of any other Western country in terms of how they tackle things.
You're the biggest nonsense on God's earth.
Well,
you haven't
I don't think so.
You're talking about. You're talking about Kemp, Ron Kemp. You quote one person. Have you read the human rights report?
It's not just Richard Kemp.
Excuse me, sir, but I take deep offense at what you're saying because people are dead. Children are dead, and you're just speaking nonsense. There were 3
Israeli children are dead. Thousands of missiles were shot indiscriminately into civilian populations. No country in the world would tolerate such behavior. I'm sorry, Professor is just focusing exclusively on one side of the story.
Okay, let's.
Excuse me, sir. There were 300 human rights reports written on Operation Cast Lead. How many have you read? I read 300 of them. How many of you read? You just speak because Ron Kemp, that imbecile, that hate agent for Israel.
Okay, I think we need to. Let's.
No, it's despicable.
Okay.
It's despicable how you carry on with your red tie and your crossed legs when people are being killed. And you say the most ridiculous.
Norman Finkelstein, where's your concern for the people of Syria? The 250,000 dead in Syria. How many reports in Syria have you read? How many? How many condemnations of the United Nations have you read there?
I about Syria every day.
And where's your condemnations of the United Nations? Where are they? Where are they?
I don't hear apologists like you. I hear
Where are they, Norman Finkelstein? Where are they? Where are the condemnations internationally?
It must be a certifiable moron if you haven't heard condemnation of Syria.
I haven't at the United Nations. I haven't seen one resolution passed.
You're dead if you haven't heard condemnation.
Not one resolution passed.
That's it. Conversation. You're brain dead. I'm not having a conversation with somebody who's brain dead. If you haven't heard every day, non-stop.
Well, you're not really having a conversation, are you? It's a diatribe.
Assad's assaults on civilians in Syria, then you're brain dead.
Okay, I think we need to dial it down just a little bit. Let's not get overexcited.
I don't want to go on because you don't know what you're talking about. I've never seen such stupidity being...
Well, I'm sorry to say that it looks like challenging Norman Finkelstein has led to him leaving the programme. Ken, do you have any final thoughts on what you've seen and heard today?
Unfortunately, I used to formally debate. One thing I know is you have to stick to the topic and B, not be insulting. And unfortunately, I've seen Norman Finkelstein in action before, and that's the classic yell, scream, quote facts, and insult. And